So in the last video, we ended up going in and creating this branch that tested out and created a employees control. Let's actually go and use this branch. So we're going to add what we have here. We'll commit created employees control with tests. And what we could do here is go back to our master branch, and we could end up merging this in here. So this is going to be create employees control with tests, and now we're merged in here. If I see git.log, I'll see that within my branch, here's our created employees control with tests. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to end up testing out directives, and again, these all have their little idiosyncrasies here. So let's do a fairly simplistic directive that we're going to test out. Let's go to our browser. We could do another branch for this. Git.checkout B, and we'll say this is going to be, we're going to have a directive which is an employee list item. Employee list item directive. So now we're on this branch, and let's actually set up a test for it. Employee list item spec.js. And we'll go over here and we're going to describe employee list item. And we'll go over here and just to get the ball rolling, we'll say it should set the name of the employee. I'll just keep it kind of simple for the moment. So we can go over here and we will go here and we'll say expect. We're going to get some HTML, okay? Because again, when we think directives, we should think UI HTML. And we'll say to contain mode. All right, of course, this is going to fail. So, should set the name. This is going to fail. We could get it to pass by just going HTML equals mode. All right, then it'll end up passing. Obviously, we don't want to end up doing that. So the question is, how do we go about creating a directive? Well, what ends up happening with directives is that if you think about the way that directives work, directives are taking some HTML and they're being compiled by Angular. And they're being compiled within the context of a scope. So we're going to need a couple of things here to get this to work. We're going to need some HTML, and we're going to need a scope as well. So if we were to go over here and test this out, or to actually get started with this, is that let's just say that we have our directive is going to look something like this. We're going to have some element that's on our page, and in order to test out our directive is going to look like this: employee list item, employee list item, and we're going to pass into this, the way that directives work, the values get passed in with attributes, and we'll say employee equals, and we'll go over here and we'll say our employee is going to equal, on the scope, we're going to have an employee. So this element is going to end up getting compiled within the context of a scope. So the way that that is going to end up working is we'll say, let's get rid of a little bit of this. Go back here. And so this is actually going to be our HTML. This would be how we would end up using the directive. And what's going to happen is that this directive is going to get compiled by Angular. So the way that that's going to happen is that Angular, we'll call this element, Angular is going to end up using its compile method, and it's going to take this HTML, and it's going to pass into this HTML some sort of scope object. So how do we end up setting this up? How do we end up doing this? Well, right now we don't even have our compile method, and the other thing here is that for our expectations, we're going to get an element, and this is going to be sort of a simple jQuery object. It's not quite jQuery, but it's going to have an HTML method that's going to give us our HTML. So we're going to take this, again, this is if we were within our app, we're going to have something like this, somewhere in a template or something like that. We're going to pass in an employee. We're going to want to compile this HTML with some scope object. And let's actually set a couple of these things up here. So let's actually put a before each here. So let's actually go and put in our before each. So we'll say before each module app. And we're going to get this compile service, which we're going to need. So we're going to say compile, and we're also going to need to create a scope object. So we'll say root scope. And we're going to do our inject. And we'll go through and clean this up and pull these out so we don't have to type this in every time. But it's not bad practice. And we're going to inject a function, and we'll inject our compile service. We'll inject our root scope. Again, root scope is basically going to allow us to generate scopes, which we want to do when we're testing this out. And we'll go over here and we'll say, let's use our underscores here so we don't have to worry about renaming a lot of things. All right, these get injected. And we'll say that we're going to compile is compile, and root scope is root scope, and so when we go over here, let's actually get our scope object by saying scope equals $root scope $new. So now we have this scope object, and we want to be able to compile this HTML. So here's our compile, here is our HTML, and we expect this to be root scope not defined, and it's not because in fact, well, we want to get the correct errors here. Okay, so what we have here is it's looking at this and it's Angular saying, I don't know what this thing is. I mean, you're telling me that, you're not telling me, but you're telling me to compile this, and it has no idea that we have it has no idea that we end up having a directive, employee list item. So let's actually create that. So we'll go over here, and inside of our JS, we'll say that this is going to be an employee list item.js. And we'll go over here and we'll Angular module app. This is going to be a directive. And we're going to call this employee list item. So we're going to return an object here, right? That's what a directive has to do. And if we were just to go over here and say template foo, we'd get an error. And the error would say, hey, look, this template just has foo. You're telling me it's supposed to have mo in here. Well, we could actually get this to pass by putting in mo. And actually, we'd have to put it in the right case. Okay, so that passes. That's not exactly what we want to do. And I just want to point out one other thing. So we'll eventually pass in an employee, but I also want to go over here, and I'm going to put in a binding expression here in my template. I'm going to say 1 + 1. Now that still passes, but let's assume that if this is going to be compiling, which we expect it to, we would also expect that our HTML to contain the number 2. Which it doesn't. And we could see that it didn't end up compiling. So the one thing that you have to do is, and again, we've seen this a number of times before. We saw this when we were looking at our controller test where we had promises, where you really have to be in a position to run the digest cycle. So once we have a scope here and we end up compiling it, then we also have to run the digest cycle to get those expressions to end up evaluating. So if we do that, our test will end up passing. And let's actually modify this a little bit to actually specify that what we want to show in here is the employee's name. Right, so that's not going to end up working out here, and because we don't have any employee that ended up getting passed in here. So let's actually, and usually this is what you end up doing, is you pass values in to your directive. We're going to pass an employee, and we're going to pass it in as an object. So now if we go back over here, here's our scope. We could say scope, and we don't actually, I mean, we could use our employee constructor, but just to get a quick pass here, I'm going to say name is equal to mo. So that's my employee, that's on the scope. This is HTML is getting compiled with that scope. Let's get rid of this too, because this will actually test out our compilation also. And we end up passing, right? And if you just wanted to take a look at this, you could say console.log element. So this will give you just the HTML. And so here's our HTML, which is just mo, but just to show you some other things you might have here, let's just say that this was within a list item. Which is what it's going to be. Now you'll see that your HTML, you can actually grab that list item as well. Okay, so that's a sort of a brief introduction into how you could end up testing out your directives. This is only really working with an inline directive, so we really probably would want to do something like, you know, this, where this is going to be URL, which is going to point somewhere, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later. Yeah, so let's actually take a look at this at this point, where right now we've got this fixed template here. Let's actually just make sure all of our tests are up and running. So we've got npm run test dev. Okay, so we've got all our tests running, but let's actually change this so that, let's assume that this is going to point to a URL. And let's say that the path is going to be JS templates, and we'll say this is going to be employee list item.js. So let's assume that when we end up setting this up, we're going to set up a route that's going to be a static route that's going to point to the / browser directory, and this is going to be our URL to load this file. So we could save this. Let's go ahead and we're going to add a node here, and this is going to be add a file here. This is going to be employee list item.html. So this will be our actual template, which I actually had done already. Okay. So at this point, if we go back to our template and we specify that this is a URL, and we go and take a look at it, we'll end up getting this error. And the error is, hey, look, I attempted to go and grab this file, and really your client-side code is not equipped to make requests to the backend. We know that the way Angular does this is with an HTTP request, and this is telling us, no, you can't do that. So then the question becomes, well, how do we get around that? Well, it's a little bit tricky, but there's a module that we can install, and we'll do this in a couple of steps. So there's a module that we can install. I'm going to get out of this, and I'm going to say npm install. And there's something called karma ng, and it's HTML2 JS preprocessor. I know that that's a mouthful, but let's actually talk a little bit about what it does. So I'm going to install this. So let me actually just give you the bottom line on this. There's the ability to take all of your templates in Angular, and instead of actually making AJAX calls to get those templates, you could actually serve all the templates together in a JavaScript file, so that there's actually a template object that sort of keeps track of when you end up making these calls. So one of the reasons why you've seen where if you end up going from page to page using something like the state provider, where you'll only see one AJAX request to get this template. It gets it the first time, and after that, it doesn't attempt to get it again. Now, that's not the browser that's causing that behavior. That's Angular. Angular has this module which keeps track of these templates, and it says, hey, look, do I know about this template? If I know about it, I'm going to just give you the template. If I don't know about it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go get it, and next time, I'll know about it. And again, it's this whole idea of this template cache. Well, we can actually, the way that this module works is it will actually create this template cache so that it doesn't actually have to go and make this AJAX request. And there might be some other ways to do this, but what we're going to end up doing here is that we're going to do something which is putting in something called the preprocessor here. So we've got these preprocessors. So what preprocessors will do is that when we tell Karma to load these files, if they match a certain pattern, Karma will run them through whatever preprocessor is installed. So the preprocessor that we're going to use, and again, the whole idea here is to take these templates and actually put them into JavaScript so that they're available for what's called the template cache, and we don't have to make an AJAX request. So our bottom line is that we don't want to make an AJAX request because we can't make it for the tests, and we'll actually talk about how we might actually use this in our application itself. Here we're just using it for testing purposes. So for our preprocessor, we're going to say, if you look anywhere, if you match this pattern inside of templates, anything that has a HTML extension, or we could probably just say anything, frankly. And we'll go over here and we'll say, we want you to use the processor, which is this HTML to JS. And this is going to be available to us because, in fact, we have it as an NPM module. So Karma is going to be aware of it because we ended up installing this preprocessor. So that's one step that we have to go through. Another step is to actually go up and say to Karma, hey, we want you to be aware of these files. So we're going to tell Karma, hey, look, we want you to pre-process these files. I don't think that the order matters much here, but we'll figure that out in a little bit. But here we'll say browser templates star.html. So we want to put these in the Karma pipeline. And so once we end up doing these two things, what should happen, I don't know if we'll actually see it here, but I'll show you how you could end up seeing it. So I'm going to run our test again. I don't expect it to pass. I think we're going to still end up getting the same errors. I just want to make sure we don't get another error. So here I've just got an unexpected token in this file, and here we can actually figure this out pretty quick. I don't need to have this bracket here, right? This is going to be, I actually did this totally incorrectly. So it's this pattern is going to be handled by this preprocessor, and make sure that these files end up loading. Let me kill this. Okay, so get that same error. That's okay. We expected to get that. I just want to do one other thing real quick, just to see if this gives me any additional information. I'm going to go and run this in this debug mode. Just want to see if I see anything here. Because I think I will, but let's just figure that out. Let me kill this. This is going to give us a whole bunch of stuff here. So we actually saw something here. We see something about pre-processing. So if we go up here, again, we have to go up quite a bit. So here we're getting this issue that this HTML to JS is not registered. Let's actually make sure that we have that available to us. Okay, so I actually see two things that I ran into. One of them was that I actually had the wrong path to my files here. This is under browser/JS. I'm not actually sure if I would like it to be under JS. Well, that's fine. We'll keep it there. So just to sort of show you, here are templates, and they're in this JS directory under browser. So I just want to show you one thing here. That I'm going to kill this. I'm going to run it again in verbose mode, and just to see that we can see that a process. And actually, let me just point out one other change that's actually a little more important. And this is, and for whatever reason, the documentation to me was actually a little bit confusing on it. But instead of just putting HTML to JS, it's actually NG, Angular HTML to JS. That seemed to do the job. And if I end up running this, let's scroll up and see if we could see this preprocessor message. So here it's actually telling me, and I actually looked in the source code to see where this gets logged out, but it's processing this file. And let's actually take a look and see what that means, that it's processing that file. I think this is kind of an interesting thing to do. And sometimes you'll do this. If something is not working, you could dig down into these modules, and sometimes you're not really even digging all that deeply. There's just really two files with the code here, and there's not much in the index. Most of it is in here. Literally, the whole module is 75 lines, and you don't have to look at all of it, but the function that's going to get called, this is how we ended up getting our message. I didn't put this in. This is part of the module. It logs this out when you're in debug mode, which is also kind of interesting. So this is where the file itself ends up getting processed. And there's a bunch of things that are happening here. The thing that I would like you to see is that when this is actually done with the callback, because it's asynchronous, let's just do a console.log for TPL and see what this actually does. Now again, I have to kill this, and let me clear myself out here, and let's run this test again. So it's actually, this was a little bit quick, but I want to pull this up and show you what actually came out, because I think it helps you understand it a little bit better. So what this does behind the scenes is that this actually creates a module. And the module it's a little bit weird, but this module is the name of the file. And not only does this module get created, but it also ends up getting run. This is something that I think we looked at run, where this actually will end up getting called directly after the module ends up starting, basically. So this runs, and the key thing that I want you to see here is that there's this template cache that exists. And what happens is that this ends up getting put into the template cache, and it ends up getting put in with this name. So that means that if we make a request to the server, if this is in there, and we make a request to the server, and we end up making a request to the server with this URL, it'll end up giving us back this HTML. And I know that seems a little bit weird, but that's actually what the template cache does. What we're doing pretty much is we are seeding the template cache so that it doesn't have to make that AJAX call. And this is actually something that's common if you say, hey, look, I don't want people to have any sort of delay when they end up making an AJAX call to load a template. I want the template to be in the template cache already. And there are tools that you can do it with, and the tools will do something like this. But we're actually just using it for testing. We don't want it to make an AJAX call. Now, the reason why it still made an AJAX call is that this ended up looking for a file loaded with this URL. We could actually if we wanted to, we could make this error go away. And we could make this error go away by actually changing our HTML so that when this ends up loading, we're going to go to browser.js. So what will happen is that now, when this ends up running, and let's actually kill our server, run this one more time, and it still is going to end up failing. Now, the reason why it ends up failing is that what we need to do is this module ends up getting created. It exists, but our test doesn't know about it. So the same way we ended up, before each of our tests, we end up bringing in the app module. If I go and I copy this, and I go back to my test itself, which is going to be over here. So here's my list item test. And I go in here, and I've got this one module here, and I say, hey, look, there's another module I want you to know about, and I want it to be available here. And I paste this in, and again, it's a little strange name for a module. I should be able to get my tests to pass. But of course, I have a little mistake here. This is not a JS file, even though the template's being compiled to JS. And at this point, our test ends up passing. The last thing that I want to do here, and again, I know that this was a little bit of a stretch to be able to do this, and maybe there are some tools that make it easier, but again, all we're doing is basically seeding our template cache to have these files load. And it's nice to turn things on with debug mode to sort of see what these templates end up looking like, and we sort of have to go back up here to find that. The last thing that I want to do is actually to modify this, because when we end up, what I had mentioned earlier is that we're sort of being dictated to as to what this URL could be. If I really wanted to have a static path that looked like this, how could I go about doing that? So what we could end up doing is that we could actually configure how things work to specify, hey, look, I know you're gonna create these templates for us in the template cache, but we don't want them to exactly match up the file names. In fact, we want you to strip out the browser part of it. We want you to strip out the prefix of browser. So let's take a look and see how we could go about doing that. So there's a setting that we could end up putting in our Karma config file. And the setting that we could put in here is actually a setting for rng html2 js preprocessor. And so this is now a configuration setting that the preprocessor will look for. In fact, if you actually went into the source code, you could see how it ends up looking for this, and this configuration object will end up getting passed. We're going to strip the prefix, and we're just going to strip off the word browser. Okay? So once we end up doing that, and if we kill this and we rerun it, let's just take a look and see what we end up getting back. So again, if you wanted to sort of dig in here, and we do a search for prefix, we should be able to find it in here, actually with a capital P. So prefix. So you can see that this is a configuration file that's being passed in here, and so it'll know to strip that out when it sets up the module. And so I'm going to kill this. Again, I notice a lot of stopping and restarting here. And let's actually run this one more time. Okay, our test is going to fail, and let's just take a look and see why it's failing here. Okay, first of all, we can see that the module is different, right? The module stripped out the browser here. So what that should do, and actually we're getting a big error message on the bottom. The reason why we're getting an error message here is saying, hey, look, I don't know about this module that you sent me. And again, we're changing the name of the module because we're actually going to access these files from a static route that doesn't exist yet, and we're just going to mount the static route on our browser folder, and it's just going to be /JS that it's going to ask for. Now I can get my test to pass by going back here and specifying this is going to be my file. So again, this module gets created dynamically. I end up accessing it, and if I go back and run this, I should see that all my tests end up passing. So definitely a lot of work to sort of go through and do that. And sometimes directive tests can be a little bit tricky, especially when you don't have inline directives. But again, it's worth the effort to have this test suite here. Again, we haven't written any server-side code, but we do have a controller, we have a directive, and we can end up using them fairly easily. So the next thing that we'll end up doing is we'll take a look at how we could actually do things like testing out our state provider, which is also going to be helpful because really at this point we've got all these unit tests that we have, so we have some confidence that we have unit tests for our employee factory, for employee business logic, for a directive, and for a list controller, but we don't actually have them all connected in the context of an app. We don't have a template that's using our employees control, and we're going to end up doing that by setting up our state for this. So that's the next one we'll take a look at.